I'm Kathy Schrier from Washington Journalism Education Association, and really happy to have this opportunity for students to meet with you because, of course, there's a lot on their minds, I'm sure you can imagine.
I was wondering what your plans are for fall sports going into next year and how you see that working.
Oh, powerful question. So the governor's order right now closes our schools to instruction, so learning and recreation, and that was definitely about sports. That order ends on June 19th. So we're kind of waiting for the governor to tell us what his summer thinking is and fall. As you know, a lot of fall sports kind of crank up in the summer, or they're allowed to have some practices early. So we're trying to push the governor into some decisions. He has to lift the order first or let it expire on the 19th. And then we got to get to the Department of Health to tell us what our social distancing requirements are. At this point, I'm hearing a lot of optimism about sports this fall. What I'm not hearing optimism about is packing the stands with family and friends because they would be too close together. And so social distancing probably for families big time in the stadiums and facilities, but a big opportunity for athletics that wasn't there this spring.
I read in a release that there would be a COVID-19 tag put on this year's transcripts. What will that do exactly, and how will colleges and employers be directed to treat the courses that have this tag on them?
That's a really good question. Thank you. The higher ed system really asked for this, and actually some employers did too, because lots of groups evaluate transcripts. The military does, scholarship organizations, and all those. So I think their idea was, we know we're in this event now, so our seniors who are heading into higher ed this next fall and our juniors who are about ready to apply for higher ed, everyone knows those students were impacted and it'll be on everyone's memory. Higher ed was worried though that there's some 8th grader out there right now taking an algebra class that counts on their high school transcript who won't be evaluated for 5 years, right? And so by then higher ed personnel turns over and all of that. So they really wanted the designator more the reminder of the moment we were in so they can make sense of a transcript in case the grade looks really off one way or the other, right? Higher or lower. It won't have any impact on how GPAs are calculated or anything like that. It will just remind us for all time's sake that the courses taken during this time were a really unusual set of circumstances. So that was the idea of that.
Have you considered implementing any social distancing or extra health measures for students and staff to follow when schools probably reopen next fall?
Yeah, we sure have. And again, the way we sort of think about this is the Department of Health and the CDC give us the guidelines. The University of Washington's virology lab is telling us Washington State's particular experience with the virus. And between those 3 groups, they tell us what the restrictions are. And it might be that we have to cut our class sizes in half, or that students stay in cohorts. So if there is an infection, the entire cohort can be isolated and not impact other students. The logistics to opening up school this fall are just absolutely enormous. And we'll do our very best to try to accommodate a lot of interests and geographies, right? The experience in Seattle will be really different than very rural Washington, who hasn't had the same impact in the same density. So yeah, we're thinking about all that stuff. Ultimately, health will decide the requirements. And my job is to get districts ready to get creative in how they want to deploy within the constraints of those requirements.
So now that online learning has been up and running in most districts for a few weeks, what kind of feedback have you gotten from students, parents, and educators? And how is that going to guide your decision making in the future regarding school closures and the guidelines that you put out?
Yeah, thank you, Annika. The feedback has been, it's been a lot, right? So we've heard a lot from students, and we've heard a lot from parents in particular. Really mixed. If you had great connectivity and a lot of experience in learning online or even connecting online, or your teacher had experience in it, it's gone much, much better than everyone who was learning it from scratch. If you were a student who had never done that, if you're a teacher who had never taught online, pretty rough start. Connectivity has been a very serious issue for some students, right? They're told to do things or engage in a Zoom classroom. They don't have the speeds, the connectivity necessarily in some places. So that's been pretty mixed bag for sure. And lately what we've been hearing is just too much volume, too many different teachers using too many different platforms, and students and families navigating, multiple platforms to try to engage and connect. So what we're doing with that is we're guiding districts into this next fall to say you need a learning management system, but you really should focus on one for your district or at least your building. You need to do professional development with your teachers so that they're really prepared to be successful with it. And if we are starting face-to-face, at least do some development and support for students so that if we suddenly have to go back to online next year, we're more prepared to do that. And then you've been reading a lot about how hard we're working to try to connect families with both devices and connectivity where they can't afford it or don't have connectivity. That'll go pretty well, but there'll still be some real gaps around the state in that. So that's some of what we're
Within the last week or so, there's been multiple lawsuits to try to end the stay-at-home order. How would, if any of these lawsuits are to be successful in ending stay-at-home orders, how would this affect school closures, or would it affect school closures at all?
This is a good question from a reporter. I'll be careful here. It's political season. I will say that to start with. So I think some of these lawsuits have really serious intention to them. The curiosity of timing for at least one or two of the people who filed them feels a lot more political than it does substantive, but at least one of them was very substantive. The timing on these things is going to be really long. I can't imagine a court will take these up in time to affect the school year. And then I would say that most of them are challenging the governor's legal authority. And, I'm not an attorney, nor am I his attorney, but he poured through the statutes on his emergency powers, and he's got really broad emergency power. I mean, really broad, and sort of no brainer in the case of a global pandemic. So I don't think these will be successful at all. If they were, the precedent would be huge because every governor exercised these similar authorities. And so Republican governors, Democratic governors across the nation, they all close schools, for example, right? 42 of the states are closed for the rest of the year. Others may still follow. So if any of these lawsuits around the country work or land, then you start questioning the executive authority of every governor in the country. So it's got huge implications. This is a really good question, by the way. I'm glad you asked.
Hi. So considering that COVID has already affected traditional standardized testing and grading and college admission processes, what advice do you have for rising juniors, seniors, and sophomores in regards to higher education?
This is an awesome question as well because we don't control all the variables, right? Standardized testing, for example, that we use in K-12 accountability is mandated by the federal government. They require us to test every grade, 3rd through 8th, and once in high school in math and ELA, and then 3 times during your career in science. So the feds determined some of this, and they gave a waiver to states this year. We're probably going to need a waiver next year. So smarter balance is a little bit in question. But then, of course, as you know, higher ed really directs a lot of these assessments. And whether they're SATs or ACTs, there are still institutions using them. And sometimes those are really hard to access in this kind of climate. Or worse, you can access them, but if you've missed out on entire blocks of, Algebra 2 or pre-calc or something, you get awfully nervous about what that score looks like. So this is one of those strange worlds where rising freshmen, sophomores, and juniors headed to higher ed soon are really subject to what the feds decide and ultimately what higher ed decide. What I'm really pleased about is higher ed is increasingly dropping SAT and ACT as a mandate in admissions, giving students the option to use their test score or not. And their enrollments are really at risk. So I know they're not interested in keeping students out because of test scores. They're working harder to flex up and get them in just because they're really desperate in the future here. So I feel good about the outcome. It's just getting there is going to feel clunky, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty on whether you need to take the SAT or not. And I would generally say it's just a good idea to do it anyways, because you might have your eye on an in-state institution and they might have made the promise, but if you change your mind and go somewhere out of state, they may not have made that promise about SAT, ACT. So I'd say everyone needs to keep being prepared for it, listening to higher ed, figuring out what their game plan is, but we don't mandate anything here at my office except I follow through on what the feds require for smarter balance.
Mr. Reykdal, what do changes in the current changes in grading policy on individual district levels and on the larger scale say about the priorities of the Washington State Board of Public Instruction?
Yeah, so grading policy was one of those ones we didn't think we were going to have to weigh into this year. It's historically been authority of OSPI. It's in our statute, but prior superintendents have delegated this to school boards. So school boards historically have had all kinds of freedom to do whatever they want on grading practices. Once this state decided we'd stay in a continuous learning model, and remember there are other states who just said we're done for the year. We didn't do that. We said we're going to keep learning. This question started to pop up immediately from districts. What do we do with grading? And they were asking for more clarity. So we definitely did some research on this, pulled together a big group of folks, reached out by video to folks. We got a lot of feedback from students who had really diverse opinions, by the way. Some who said keep it the same, some who said pass fail, others who said, you know, A's only, others who said if you do A only, that's totally unfair to the A students. If a D student also gets an A. We heard everything about this. So where we landed is what you probably read. Districts will continue to grade. They're not allowed to give F's this term. If they don't know if a student has met learning standards, they can give them an incomplete. And that creates an obligation for the district to really engage that student in the future to improve the grade if they want. All students during this term can improve their grades only and not go backwards. So you can't go from an A to a B or a B to a C. You can only maintain or improve your grade with engagement, or again, take an incomplete if you just aren't confident you're getting the connection. Maybe you don't have connectivity, maybe you're in a family situation that doesn't allow it. So that's kind of where we landed on grades. The bigger issue that's coming up is just candidly how ridiculous grades have been in the past in this state and in other states. It's mostly measuring how much volume of work students do, and it isn't necessarily evaluating what students know. There are students who are quite brilliant who get quote unquote bad grades, and there are students who don't necessarily master the expectations, but they turn in all the homework, they do extra credit, they do volumes of work, and therefore they get a good grade. And I'm not judging that either way, right? That's what every state's been doing for more than 100 years. We're trying to move to standards-based grading, get down the volume of worksheets and volume of homework and volume of information to really get at whether or not students know concepts in history or know concepts in math or in English language arts. So this has been a really eye-opening moment for our state, and we're going to use it as a springboard to dive into standards-based grading a little bit more in the future and standards-based learning. We have districts who do it already. They actually only give out a 4, 3, 2, or 1, right? Exceed standards, meet standards, approaching standards are really struggling. It's higher ed that forces that 4-point scale into a letter grade system so that they can calculate GPAs so that they can continue to evaluate students for admission. So it's pretty interesting how much higher ed influences our K-12 system, specifically our high school grading.
So, what has the conversation been like on the topic of how the beginning of this coming school year is going to look like in contrast to a typical school year for the schools in our state?
Yeah, so that's what that big planning effort's about. We're going to launch it here soon. A lot of voices on that. There are logistical questions, like how do we do it? The question earlier was about, kind of what are our guiding principles here. Health will be the guide on this. Department of Health will tell us what we can't do. They'll tell us all of the sort of physical distancing parameters and restrictions. And then this task force we're putting together will create a menu of options for districts on how they might open up this fall. We've got a group already looking at what's happening in other countries and other states. Japan had a very successful relaunch. We think Italy and Spain are struggling with their relaunch, and we want to know what was the difference and what did they try to do. So this group will do that. We met last week with Legislative Youth Advisory Group, the LIAC group. We're going to invite a couple of those students to be student voices on this task force as well. We want to hear about the experience of students and then kind of what they're thinking about this fall. So I want to be clear, those are two things. The health science will guide us and then our planning effort, but then there's another thing that's harder to judge. Will students and parents want to come back? So even if the science starts to look in our favor and we say we've got all the right PPE and we know how to socially distance and we've figured all this out, there's a lot of anxiety about this, including some of our school employees, right? Especially if they're over the age of 60. So we also have to do sort of a social science questioning process to ask what is the psychology of our students and will they feel comfortable coming back? I think a lot of y'all are just sort of sick and tired of distance and want to be back, and yet there's some real health fears out there, and that's really real. So that's a part we haven't quite figured out. Probably some survey work to try to understand that, surveying students and parents and families. And then if it's really geographically different, that drives different models. If Grant County students all want to come back, they're going to have a much better opportunity. If 40% of students in King County say, I'm afraid, it makes me nervous, there was a lot of mortality here, well, those districts are going to have to probably pick some kind of blended model with a lot more online learning. That's the kind of menu of options we have to create.
Okay, so I was just wondering what the school year budget will look like next year, having to do with COVID and like each district and everything.
Yeah, this is a nerve-wracking time for districts. They're normally budgeting right now for their next year and finishing their budgets actually for next year. So our state drives virtually all the money out to our school districts by formula. There's some competitive grants and a few things, but almost all of it goes out by formula. And there's really three kinds. There's state money, which is like 70% of all the money districts get. There's federal money, that's down to 7 or 8% of what districts get on average. And then the rest is local levies and local revenue, which is totally up to local voters, right? They run levies every 1, 2, 3, 4 years. The current conversation is that the money for this school year is going to be fine. There'll be no cuts this year. Next school year's budget's actually already set by the legislature. But if they come back in a special session, then there's nervousness about them reducing a few things. What's really scary for districts is if their levy cycles up. If they're due to go back to voters for a levy, when you have a 20% unemployment rate and lots of people nervous about the economy, will they still support those local property taxes? I think that's probably the biggest concern in the short term. There's a little federal emergency money coming to help with all these COVID costs, but it's it's like 1.3% of our budget equivalent. It's a couple $100 million, but we normally spend $15 billion a year. So that's not going to be a salvation, but it'll help districts who have spent a little money reacting and responding to this. And then I guess the last thing I'd say about budgets is if you just run a face-to-face model, we know how to do that. And now we're getting better at an online model. If the health requirements cause us to do both, that's going to be really challenging. If students get to come to school every day for part of a day or every other day, and you need all your regular teachers to be in the school, but then students need a lot more support online, we don't see anything in budgets that are going to allow us to hire a bunch more staff. And so we're all kind of waiting for the Department of Health to say to us, you don't get to have 30 students in classes next year, it's 15 or 18. And if that happens, that's going to be a really, really hard thing to plan for. It's going to mean less instructional hours for most students is what it's going to mean.
So going back to grading really quickly, you gave flexibility to the school districts in terms of grading, but now Seattle and Bellingham are operating on an A or incomplete system, while Cedar Woolley School District is operating on A, B, C, and incomplete. Do you think that this puts students at an unequal advantage or disadvantage?
Not really. It certainly could impact GPAs a little, right? The ABC system is going to replicate a lot more of what we've been doing. For students in the AI systems, I think there'll be a little blip for one term for some classes where the GPA looks a little healthier. It's exactly the reason higher ed and the business community said, can you please put a notation on transcripts for this period of time? If they look across and see every single student getting an A in Seattle School District, those institutions want to remember that and say, okay, that probably wasn't the normal time, and they want to factor that into their thinking. So there's been a huge raging debate on whether an AI system is more equitable, right? It's more just, or is it really not equitable? Because does it tell a student who really didn't meet learning standards, you've got an A now, you were passing, and will they really engage in the learning if they all know they have an A? And there's been a tremendous bit of debate about this in our state and a little bit across the country. So we stopped short of being the big heavy agency that told them exactly how to grade, because we have never done that. We just tightened down the parameters, said no Fs, use incompletes when necessary, but we still allowed them to pick their grading scale. So I don't think it'll be too impactful, but higher ed's got a tough task as they evaluate transcripts over the next 4 years.
What are some of the modifications we could see to the in-person learning model come this fall?
Yeah, well, we're modeling those, so I don't know that we know for sure, but some of the stuff we've heard, for example, is alternating schedule. If you can't have, so assuming you can't have all the regular student volumes in a classroom, if you can only have 15 instead of 30, Well, we can't double the number of classrooms or double the number of teachers. It means students are only in classes half as much. So it could be, you know, alternating A-B schedules. You're either on the A system or the B system, and you go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Tuesday, Thursday the next week. Or every student goes every day, but they're only there for half a day. It could be one model we've observed and are starting to look into is all the K-8 students get a face-to-face experience every day because they're the ones who are most at risk if parents have to go back to work. You know, there's no childcare for an elementary school student. So put your K-8s in your buildings and really put the heavy load of online learning on just your high school students. So it's pretty wild because we don't have our health parameters yet to know exactly how that's going to fall. But we're starting to research in other countries and other states all the things they're considering or even doing. And then once that health guidance lands, we can narrow it down and say to districts, well, this is the menu of options that you have given the restrictions that are upon you. But boy, districts may choose really, really different systems. We want to let locals be locals, right? They're locally elected school boards, and we want them to make those decisions. But we need to give them really good information on the pros and cons of each model. And as some of you have asked, people will eventually ask us, does this create inequity, right? And that's the challenge of this moment. We designed something where every student gets more than 1,000 instructional hours a year. And now we're in a model where it can be totally different depending on where you live. So this is tough for every state in the country.
My question is, will there be plans or policies created due to COVID-19 and the health issues for student gatherings and health codes in the schools as well?
There will be, and it's already coming, right? People are asking, like, how quickly can we do some learning this summer? What about graduation this spring? So those questions about gatherings and all that are already here this year. The governor's pretty much squashed those as an option, but immediately we're getting the questions, what happens after June 19th and what happens this fall? So yeah, that'll all be part of that Department of Health guidance. It might vary a little bit depending on where you live. Again, if you're in a rural community with low population density, you actually reduce the probability of spreading the virus. So maybe more students can congregate in that case than really dense areas. So that's part of why I think coming out of this, it'll look a little different than the way we came in, where it was just sort of blanket closure, you know. But that's really up to the governor ultimately based on the health data.